What I want to say is welcome everyone to the March 2023 meeting of the Oregon Archaeological Society. Tonight, our speaker is Megan McGuinness. Megan is a Jones Scholarship winner a year or so, 2 years ago, whatever. Megan, her title tonight is Uplands and Valleys, Settlement Patterns in the Northwestern Great Basin. A little bit of background on Megan. She just received her MA from the University of Nevada, Reno, studying under Jeff Smith. She is working now in La Grande, which is a real transition for a Portland girl. She's working in La Grande for an engineering firm. She's the in-house archaeologist for an engineering firm, that's kind of a cool thing. And she would have been here tonight in person, except she has an excavation in Echo and she couldn't get away for it. So with all that, Megan, let's hear about Uplands and Valleys, Settlement Patterns in the Great Basin. Take it away.
All right, thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. Can you guys hear me okay online and in the planetarium there?
It looks great.
Awesome.
Things sounds good.
Great. So yeah, I just graduated last April from the University of Nevada, Reno, and Jeff Smith was my advisor along with Christopher Jaswa. And Jeff Smith, if you were there at the OAS presentation last month, he presented on Warner Valley, and I'll also present on Warner Valley a little bit tonight too. But I was a recipient of the Roy Jones Scholarship in 2021, I believe, and I just wanted to thank you guys all for the opportunity and for the funding. It really allowed me to do the work that I needed to do for my thesis, which I'll explain a little bit further here. But yeah, it was a really great project that I worked on at the University of Nevada, and I'm excited to share with you guys. So I will start right now. The longer title, which didn't fit on to my thesis very well, was Over Uplands and Across Valleys, a test of ideal free distribution predictions for human settlement during the terminal Pleistocene, early Holocene, and Northwestern Great Basin. So when I think about the Great Basin, I think of really dry, windblown playas and sagebrush seas that go on for miles and miles. However, the Great Basin is home to several diverse environments, including marshes, lakes, streams, and rocky table uplands. During the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene, people living in the Northwestern Great Basin encountered these environments and settled in them, having the agency to choose ones that best fit their needs. Many early archaeological sites in the Great Basin are found in relic lakes and wetlands, but some are also found far away from water in upland areas. So currently, we really don't know what factors led the earliest people in the region to favor some environments over others. So in my thesis, I explored the settlement decisions of people in the Northwestern Great Basin by calculating suitability of 4 different basins within the framework of an ideal free distribution model, which I'll get to in just a little bit after the archaeological materials or background. So a little bit of background for this area and kind of what I'm working on. The Great Basin landscape really saw some changes during the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene. Cooler, wetter climate during the Bowling-Ollerod and the Younger Dryas created an abundance of lakes that covered much of the Great Basin. By the end of the Younger Dryas marked this beginning of a warmer early Holocene, which lakes began to desiccate. Some lakes completely dried up while others became wet meadows or pretty productive wetlands. So in this figure 1.1 here, the Younger Dryas and early Holocene sites are in yellow, and the early Holocene sites are in red, and open air sites are in blue. So archaeological evidence at the Paisley 5-mile point caves in the Summer Lake Basin show that people were occupying the area by about 14,200 Cal BP, and sites nearby such as Connolly Caves and Cougar Mountain Cave in the Fort Rock Basin were positioned around pluvial lakes and wetlands during the terminal Pleistocene. By the early Holocene, evidence shows that people still inhabited these caves, but also expanded away from wetland resources. So sites such as Little Steamboat Point in North Warner Valley, which Jeff Smith talked about last month, Dirty Shame Rock Shelter in southeastern Oregon, Hanging Rock Shelter, and Last Supper Cave in northwestern Nevada were first occupied during the early Holocene, and these sites are located in rocky table uplands. So we see this kind of shift from wetland areas to now these more upland areas where people are moving. And this is kind of a really interesting, fascinating thing that we're seeing. During this time for the technology, there was fluted and concave points, western stem points, and crescents, which are all kind of markers of this terminal Pleistocene, early Holocene occupation. And stem points are especially prominent, with 9 different types being identified. So in open air sites, most stem point sites are found in lower elevations and where relic lakes and wetlands existed. Fluted point sites tend to be found in valley bottoms, such as the Dietz site, or near draws or at the base of small hills, such as Sage Hen Gap and Sheep Mountain. Stem sites are also found and sometimes associated with carved abstract, Great Basin carved abstract petroglyphs, which can be found in uplands usually. A little bit more background. The lack of open air large game sites in the Great Basin suggests to some archaeologists that large game was not as readily sought after, though these kill sites could simply be buried or not preserved. Direct subsistence evidence from coprolites from Paisley Cave shows that people had diverse diets, including plants, seeds, small mammals, fish, and insects. Indirect evidence from hearth features in Connolly Caves also shows that people's diets included seeds, cattail, fish, and eggs. These subsistence residues can inform our understanding of people's foraging decisions and help create models for settlement subsistence. And lastly, human mobility patterns can provide clues about foraging choices. There are basic trends of Paleo-Indian mobility patterns in the Great Basin that archaeologists have studied. First, previous models show that residential storage and midden features are really rare during these times. Second, Western stem points were found as a multi-use tool, which would be really useful for mobile groups. And third, geochemical sourcing of these tools shows that people usually traveled pretty long distances. And one of the last things is that many Western stem points are found near pluvial lakes, kind of suggesting that people were tethered to or really frequented wetlands. So the questions I looked at are, which habitats did people settle in during the Younger Dryas and early Holocene? How was settlement influenced by resource availability? And how did environmental change from the Younger Dryas to the early Holocene influence settlement? And these are all kind of questions that I asked based off of the trends that we had been seeing and what was missing for them. So an application of the model I was talking about earlier, the ideal free distribution model, can offer means to better understand these questions. But what is this model? So the ideal free distribution model uses measures of habitat suitability to create predictions about how people distribute themselves over a landscape. So over the last 20 years, the IFD has become popular for modeling human dispersal behaviors, especially when looking at complex societies, because it is well suited to understand decisions that populations make when distributing themselves in areas based on variables that maximize their fitness. So if you think about kind of your everyday life, where do you kind of position yourself on a landscape in terms of where you like to, what things you like to be close to, and where you want to, what's going to be the easiest for you to get to it. So if you really like ice cream, you're going to probably live next to a place that has ice cream. It's a little bit more complex than that, but you kind of get the idea that you're maximizing your fitness on the landscape based on where you want to live. So the IFD uses measures of suitability, and suitability refers to the goodness of a habitat. And these measures can include food resources, materials, access to trade routes, protection, and water availability. These measures of suitability are calculated using spatial distribution of environmental resources and what we know about cultural factors that influence how people value those resources. The measures of suitability allow for a ranking system to be then applied to those different habitats. So in figure 1.3a, and I promise I won't show figures this whole time, it shows the suitability of 2 habitats. Habitat A is highest ranking and habitat B is the lowest ranking habitat. This figure shows the relationship between Declining suitability of habitat A and the letter I shows when people should expand to a new habitat as population density increases based on a negative density IFD model. So basically that means if you have more people in the basin, your resources will decrease. So if you have more people moving to an area near your favorite ice cream store, those resources are going to be harder to get, and you're going to have to maybe find a new ice cream store. So that's kind of how I like to simplify it a little bit in my brain, at least. So the application of the IFD model includes a set of general assumptions and predictions. The two predictions that are relevant in this study are that people will always settle in habitats with the highest overall suitability first, and when new settlers enter the system, some people will stay in the high initial ranking habitat, but others, usually the newcomers, will move and settle in the next highest ranking basin, which is now of equal suitability to the initial ranking basin because of resources being negative density dependent. So going with this prediction one, people will settle in habitats with high initial suitability, such as this lovely meadow here. Once people move into the habitat, there we go. Once people move into the habitat, let me get this. And populations start to grow, resources will start to diminish, and the highest ranking resources will usually go first. And then more people will arrive, but the next best habitat will not be settled in until its suitability matches that of the first highest ranked habitat. And once resources get too low, the area will not be abandoned, but it would be advantageous for newcomers of the population to expand to the next best habitat, which is of equal quality to the first habitat now. So these predictions allow us to kind of understand choices that people may have made in terms of settlement and carrying capacity of a basin. And the Northwestern Great Basin is a really good candidate for the IFD model because there's a great archaeological record available. There's several basins that have really good geoarchaeological data, abundant time diagnostic Western stem points, and similar habitats and resources that are available and have been there for the last thousands of years. This kind of suggests that people settled in places that really best fit their needs. So getting into my material, so that's just the model part. So now I'm going to throw in all my materials and materials and methods into the model. So getting into this section, I start with the form and age of diagnostic points. Since all these basins contain open air sites, I used 4 Western stem points as time markers in lieu of radiocarbon dates. There's been a lack of chronological control for Western stem points, but Richie Rosenkrantz, he's a colleague and friend of mine. He did a thesis in 2019 that reviewed radiocarbon dates associated with these Western stem points and obtained several additional dates for materials from legacy collections at well-known Western stem sites and proposed a working chronology allowing for kind of this relative time sequence to be available. So in the Northern Great Basin, Rosenkrantz dated Haskett to 12,600 to 11,700 cal BP, and Cougar Mountain, Windus Square, Windus Concave Base, and Parman to 11,240 to 8,900 cal BP. Additionally, I do include fluted points, and dated fluted points remain ambiguous in the Great Basin. However, other regions have fluted points dating to the terminal Pleistocene. And there is evidence of older Western stem points in the Great Basin, older than Haskett's, but for this model, I use Haskett's as they appear at many of the sites. I also assume that fluted and Haskett points date to the Younger Dryas, in Cougar Mountain, Windus Square, Windus Concave, and Parman date to the early Holocene. I looked at the Western stem assemblages from all of these basins, or looked at previous reports, and it was really great because the University of Nevada, Reno had all of these points in the collections at the university, except for the collection from the Dietz site, and that's where the Roy Jones scholarship money went to. I spent a week at the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History and was able to look through the Dietz Western stem collection. A lot of people know the Dietz site for the Clovis, but there's also a really great Western stem collection there. And I was able to collect data and take pictures. And I just really love the drawing on the brown paper bag. I thought that was really great. So again, thank you for that. That was really helpful and allowed me to include an additional basin into my work. So here's an overview of all the basins. Each of these basins had paleo-environmental and archaeological surveys conducted that kind of allowed me to understand the past environment and what points and what types of sites were usually found in these basins. Starting up north is the Alkali Basin, but specifically focused on the North Alkali Basin Study Area, or the NABSA, as I might call it a couple times. Towards the middle is Warner Valley, which Jeff Smith talked about last month. And then there's also the Guano Valley at the Oregon-Nevada border and Hoxie-Woxie Valley down there as well. There are funny stories to the names, at least of Hoxie-Woxie Valley, that I'm sure someone will get to tell you in the future, but I'll continue on. So the North Alkali Basin Study Area, or the NABSA, prior research was conducted by Dr. Judith Willig and Dr. Ariane Pinson in the 1990s to 2000s, with substantial research focused on the Dietz site because of the extensive Clovis points found there. Dr. Willig suggested a deeper lake existed during the terminal Pleistocene and that people using Western stem points occupied the basin during this time. However, Pinson's geoarchaeological work indicated that the basin was most likely dry or contained a wet meadow during the Younger Dryas, kind of similar, it would have looked similar to this photo here. But then during the early Holocene, it became a playa with sagebrush steppe environments. So in analyzing the collection from the Dietz Basin, there was about maybe 122 diagnostic fluted and Western stem points found here. And then next is the North Warner Valley Study Area, which is 50 kilometers southeast of North Alkali Basin, and it's in the northern section of the Warner Valley. Prior research was conducted by Dr. Teresa Riston and Dr. Jeffrey Smith. Riston's geoarchaeological work indicated that during the terminal Pleistocene, Lake Warner would have been high, sitting at about 1,390 meters above sea level, between about 14,300 and 12,400 cal BP. After the pause, the lake recessed and moved southward. So around 10,300 cal BP, the lake had disappeared from the project area, and sagebrush steppe and greasewood likely covered the valley, kind of looking how it looks today. 65 fluted and Western stem diagnostic points were collected with the survey work done there. Next is the Guano Valley and Catnip Creek Delta that is located about 70 kilometers east of Lakeview, Oregon. The locality lies in southern Guano Valley along the Oregon-Nevada border. Prior research was conducted there by Dr. Derek Rayo and colleagues. Rayo's geoarchaeological work shows that during the Younger Dryas south of Guano Lake, there would have been meandering channels of varying sizes, facilitating a stable riparian zone. These channels persisted into the early Holocene, so there really wasn't a lot of change as far as we can tell right now between the Younger Dryas and the early Holocene. In this delta area, you can actually still see some of the channels today, not necessarily with water in them, but there's just relic channels there. So there was over 637 Western stem points found there. However, when I was analyzing the collection, there were many broken and non-diagnostic points, so I was able to show about 68 Western stem points there, but further analysis might increase this number. Finally, Hoxie-Woxie is a pluvial lake located in the Oregon-Nevada border. Research there has been conducted by the University of Nevada, Reno, and most recently, Erica Bradley and colleagues. While geoarchaeological research is still in its infancy here, backhoe trenching suggests that the basin was a marsh or wet meadow during the early Holocene and possibly a shallow lake during the Younger Dryas. So pretty similar, same as Guano Valley, there wasn't a whole lot of change going on. To date, over 402 diagnostic points have been recorded here, plus about 400 more non-diagnostic. And I think there's been a lot I think Dan Stuber and Erica Bradley have been looking at more of the collection. I think there's even more than that. It's a really impressive site in a really beautiful area. So continuing on with the model, the materials I used were basic environmental zones that are found in the Great Basin, which include wetlands, lakes, riparian zones, uplands, and sagebrush steppe. And then I also used resources found in ethnographic literature. And I assume that all of these environmental zones existed during the Younger Dryas and early Holocene. So the 12 resources I used are 8 fauna and 4 flora, all of which are found in the Great Basin, and again, have been mentioned in ethnographic literature. Here I include the resources and what environments I place them into each model, into the model. So while there are clearly way more than 12 resources in the Great Basin, I started with these as they were mentioned in ethnographic literature, and the data was available for their densities and return rates. For this section, I went through and determined what environments these resources would be present in and when they would be seasonally available for people to acquire. For example, seeds of Great Basin wild rye and Indian ricegrass are best in the fall, and cattail roots have higher caloric return rates in the fall and winter. I also learned that pronghorn do not have dew claws on their hooves, unlike deer and elk. So dew claws make it really easy to walk in wet areas. So often pronghorns will avoid wet habitats. So I kind of built this model based on plant returns and animal behaviors, kind of determining where they would be and wouldn't be during different seasons. I would also expect that people knew where plants and animals would be seasonally and when they'd be available based on the seasons, just as we do today when we think about modern hunting practices in the Northwestern Great Basin. So here's some math going on. Using the resources I mentioned, I estimated the potential suitability of the basins by creating 2 proxies to evaluate which basins would have been more suitable for people based on caloric abundance and return rates. So I defined 2 estimates for suitability in each environmental zone. One was the caloric resource potential, or the CRP, and 2 is the return rate potential, or the RRP. Basically, the CRP is derived from a total density of calories potentially available in each environmental zone, which is the kilocalories per hectare, or whatever area that you'd use. This proxy favors habitats with high abundance of food resources, such as plants, which are high ranked regardless of whatever effort it takes required to process them. And the RRP is derived from caloric return rates from resources in each environmental zone, so kilocalories per hour. This proxy favors habitats with large quantities of high return rate species, such as deer and pronghorn sheep. For the CRP, I used an abundance calculation from Nell and Hill, 2012. It just multiplies the resource density by the edible weight in kilograms, by the kilocalories per kilogram for resource, by the coal rate. It collected the variables for each species, adopting much of the data from Nell and Hill and using modern population estimates. Thus, the density estimates are heuristic for animals, as current numbers do not accurately reflect what the size and population size of species were prior to European contact. For the RRP, I calculated the average return rate of each species by using the minimum and maximum return rates provided by Sims in 1987. I also looked at change over time, and to do this, I went back and kind of rebuilt the environments by using ArcGIS Pro and looked at the elevation models and try to determine where the actual lake would be. For example, this is the North Warner Valley, and I tried to estimate where the lake would have been and then how much it changed and what was the area it changed during the Younger Dryas to the early Holocene. And then I figured out the percentage of that and basically multiplied that area by the total area, and then divided each environmental zone by the total hectares of each basin to get a proportion, and then multiplied that by 100 to get a percentage. And yes, so this all kind of comes together. There's a lot of moving pieces to this thesis, but it all comes together in just a few minutes. So going back to the questions, which habitats did people settle in during the Younger Dryas and early Holocene? How is settlement influenced by resource availability, and how did environmental change from the Younger Dryas to the early Holocene influence settlement? So of course, I have my hypotheses. Hypothesis 1 is habitats with higher caloric resource potential should be ranked highest and therefore settled in first. And hypothesis 2, habitats with high return rate potential should be ranked highest and therefore settled in first. And with this are my predictions. Prediction 1, the highest ranked basins during the Younger Dryas should have higher densities of Younger Dryas points, which are the fluted and Haskett points, and lower ranked basins should have lower densities of Younger Dryas points. In prediction 2, during the early Holocene, population should increase. Increases should yield increases in points in both higher and lower ranked habitats. In prediction 3, if environmental change influences the relative rank of habitats between the Younger Dryas and early Holocene, then populations should redistribute themselves such that higher ranked habitats during the early Holocene have higher point densities. And if ranks are the same, then higher ranked habitats should continue to contain higher point densities. So we'll come back to these predictions. But here's kind of some of the summaries that I came up with. So the CRP estimates that the wetland and riparian zone have higher caloric abundance than other environmental zones. And of course, the CRP was favoring any area that had really high density of plants. So if you have a lot of cattail or a bulrush, this is going to be any wetlands or riparian zones are definitely going to favor the CRP proxy. And then the RRP estimate, of course, estimates that uplands and sagebrush steppe have higher resource return rates than other environmental zones. And that's going to be because you have these high return rate species such as bighorn sheep, mule deer, and pronghorn. So there's already these two kind of, there's two differences going on. One proxy is favoring plant resources and one is favoring fauna resources. So environmental zone percentage in each basin, the Guano Valley and Hoxie-Woxie Valley have the highest percentage of riparian and wetlands during the Younger Dryas, and the North Alkali Basin had the highest percentage of sagebrush steppe, and Guano Valley had the highest percentage of uplands. So going back to kind of piecing it together, I've now included all of these basins and what kind of environmental zones that they had in it. So these are all the percentages of that. And during the early Holocene, these numbers really only changed in the North Alkali Basin and North Warner Valley Basin, where the North Alkali Basin lost all the wet meadow / wetland area, and the lake in the North Warner Valley retreated southward, creating more space for sagebrush steppe environment. So there are some changes going on that are actually changing what resources would be seen in these basins. And also, this is looking at the western stem densities in each basin compared with the suitability model ranking. So during the CRP results do not really correspond with the projectile point densities during the Younger Dryas. The highest ranked basin, the Guano Valley, has the lowest density of Younger Dryas projectile points. And the RRP results correspond more closely with both the Younger Dryas and early Holocene basin rankings. And here I'll note that these rankings are pretty relative, since the annual RRP in each basin is similar except the Guano Valley. And this nuance kind of suggests that the estimates are all relative suitability, and they're just as important as absolute rankings because any basin could have been settled in at any time. So that's just kind of showing the point densities and then the rankings of each basin, which is part of the model there. And then this is for change over time, going back to the North Warner Valley study area. This is showing where all the sites are, in addition between the Younger Dryas and early Holocene. And I think the Western stem sites kind of closely align with the projected environmental zone locations in each basin and how local conditions changed over time. Most sites containing fluted and hasket points were found along the edges of lakes and wetlands, and these points appear on basin floors that presumably held water during the Younger Dryas, suggesting that people during the early Holocene still continued to use these basins even as the landscape and resource availability changed. So overall, for the model, using the model, the RRP as a proxy for suitability yielded the predictions that the basin with the greater area of environmental zones that support high return rate species of fauna would have been the most suitable places for people to settle. I did also look at time averaging because that's something that could kind of throw this off, since a lot of my model is built on projectile points. The Younger Dryas spanned about 1,300 years, but the early Holocene spanned about 3,400 years. So if the early Holocene was about 3 times as long as the Younger Dryas, if all things were equal, there should be 3 times as many early Holocene points as the Younger Dryas. However, this is not the case. Overall, the Younger Dryas points were discarded more frequently than the early Holocene, and this kind of suggests that any difference in density is likely not a function of the different time spans, but a lower overall use of projectile points, which I'll get into in just a little bit. So to go over my predictions, again, the prediction 1, the higher ranked basins during the Younger Dryas should have higher densities of Younger Dryas points, and lower ranked basins should have lower point densities. For the CRP, it was not supported, as the Guano Valley was the highest ranked basin during the Younger Dryas, but had the lower point density. And for the RRP, it was supported as the North Alkali Basin, North Warner Valley Basin, and Hoxie-Woxie Valley are all high ranked, but have higher point densities. So prediction 2 is during the early Holocene, population increase yield increases in points in both higher and lower ranked habitats. Both the CRP and RRP proxies were partially supported because all these basins have an increase in points during the early Holocene, except the North Alkali Basin. In point densities in the lower ranked basins in the RRP, which were Guano Valley and Hoxie-Woxie Valley, increased substantially. But when normalizing for time, point densities in the North Alkali Basin and North Warner Valley decrease. And then prediction 3, if environmental change influences the relative rank of habitats between the Younger Dryas and early Holocene, populations should redistribute themselves such that higher ranked habitats during the early Holocene will have higher point densities. If ranks are the same, higher ranked habitats should continue to contain higher point densities. The CRP proxy was not supported, and the RRP was largely supported. The relative ranks of the RRP proxy do not change between the Younger Dryas and early Holocene, and prediction point distribution maintains consistency with Younger Dryas patterns, except in the Guano Valley where it increases. So basically, overall, the RRP proxy better matches predictions of the IFD model compared to the CRP proxy. And the RRP proxy, again, is derived from caloric return rates. So habitats with those larger high return rate species will usually be higher ranked, and people will want to, or be, according to the model, would be more attracted to these areas, and they'd be more sought after. So this might suggest that Paleo-Indians may have chosen to settle in habitats positioned in areas where high return resources were more accessible. Therefore, the data more clearly supports hypothesis 2, although, as I will discuss, it's not just high return rate species, it's also plants that were important parts of the diet. So Paleo Indian archaeological assemblages contain large projectile points and form tools, but few groundstone implements or specialized seed processing tools. This evidence suggests to many archaeologists that Paleo-Indians favored hunting more than groups later in time. Yet, the paucity of large game or large mammal hunting and butchering in open air sites in the Great Basin does not really support this interpretation. In fact, direct and indirect evidence from coprolites and hearth features indicates that Paleo-Indian diets were very diverse. The result from my study also highlights this interesting contradiction. The RRP proxy estimates that the most suitable habitats would have been those that would favor hunting potential. However, the Western stem sites in all the basins usually cluster around relic wetlands and lakes. So there's these totally two opposite things going on. A potential explanation for this might be division of labor. And this is because according to the RRP proxy estimates, people may have been drawn to areas with access to high return resources, such as uplands and sagebrush steppe environments where large game was prevalent. Placing settlements in uplands and sagebrush steppe would only make sense if return rates from large game were high enough to provision for the whole family, as logistical strategies are usually at odds with settlement. Since abundant plant resources are harder to deplete than large game, plants would have been more reliable resource. Together, uplands and wetlands have the potential to influence habitat suitability and habitat because these environments provide resources to any strategy implemented under a community's division of labor. Variability in men and women's foraging goals is widely accepted at ethnographic periods, but not as easily applied to the younger Dryas and early Holocene. As some researchers recognize environments and social economic dynamics were different, suggesting that human behavior was also different. We see evidence of this in contemporary hunter-gatherer groups in Africa, South Africa, and Australia, where men and women specialize in different resources and maximize household production together for the rest of the group. The divergence of labor created a safety net for when high-risk resources are not procured. Therefore, it would be beneficial for groups to settle in locations where high yield, low risk resources can be targeted by larger portions of a community, but closer to areas where large game can be intercepted by other subgroups. In the Great Basin, ethnographic literature from the Klamath, Surprise Valley Paiute, Northern Paiute, and Shoshone parallels the contemporary hunter-gatherer groups. Women and children focused on continuous, low-risk, predictable resources, as men focused on high-risk tasks. The women, children, and elderly would help with communal drives of antelope and rabbit. Habitats may have been considered more suitable based on where reliable resources could have been easily procured and where high unreliable resources would have been close by. So it's kind of, I guess, positioning themselves kind of in an area where you're both in an upland and near a wetland area would be pretty much the best locations for any subsistence practice. The time averaging shows that there was lower projectile point counts during the early Holocene, which suggests there may have been a change in subsistence strategies as well. I'm going back to the initial occupation of rock shelters during the early Holocene. That might have been a general expansion to uplands for hunting strategies. At LSP1, the Little Steamboat Point, data show that people first occupied the site around 9,775 cal BP, when the North Warner Valley would have been exclusively sagebrush steppe. LSP1 features extensive jackrabbit remains, indicating people may have processed large numbers of leopards, but I think they're still working on that at UNR. So it is possible that instead of people focusing on large game, people use communal hunting and nets to capture mass quantities of jackrabbits, which ultimately would decrease projectile point use and overall densities of projectile points that we would see. Annual variability of suitability rates are important to factor in the study as well. Paleo-Indians may have traveled to different habitats as means of risk aversion and to harvest different seasonally available resources. In this way, groups would maximize resource returns based on seasonal availability. If Paleo-Indians followed resources seasonally, projectile point densities might be lower because they're targeting resources that did not require stone projectile points to acquire them. So looking back at the whole model and trying to understand the settlement patterns, there are a couple of caveats to the approach. I used Western stem projectile point densities to measure people's settlement patterns, and projectile points are, of course, reflective of hunting strategies, although Western stem points can be a multi-tool. In this study, most are found around lakes and wetlands, and people may have brought broken projectile points back to residential camps near wetlands and riparian zones for repair or discard after hunting, when they were hunting maybe in the nearby sagebrush steppe or uplands. So analyzing impact fractures on Western stem points recorded in these areas would be kind of a good way to show whether or not people were hunting outside of the wetland area or inside the wetland area. That would kind of help tie up some questions. Other variables may offer incentives to settle in, such as proximity to important resources such as springs, toolstone, and rock shelters. And this map on here, Pinson 2011, suggests that the Dietz site in the North Alkali Basin was important because it was near kind of this regularly traversed corridor and connected to several different basins. It also had good toolstone in the basin, but it's really a super unassuming spot compared to other sites around that area. So another thing is that indigenous ontologies about the landscape may offer more information on suitable places based on qualitative and cultural perspectives. But I think one of the biggest things to this, to doing this model, is the limitations of the data set. Many of the resources I used were, the data came from other states, or you can't really measure how many paleo, I guess, deer there were back in the day, or if they were even there. So these are all just assumptions for the model. Also, I only used 12 resources. So I think if I were to double the amount of resources used, or even triple it, the model might show something completely different. So there's a lot that can be done to kind of mold and recreate parts of the different data that I put into it, and maybe something would be different, or maybe it'd be the same. It's kind of interesting to see. So the results of the suitability rankings show that sagebrush steppe or uplands, upland habitats were highly ranked, and perhaps early people positioned themselves around them to intercept high return rate species. However, archaeological evidence shows that Western stem sites are positioned around relic lakes and wetlands. This suggests that people may have made decisions on where to settle based on kind of two different scales. One would be in and outside of a basin. So for future work, I'd like to include more plants and animal resources found on the Great Basin into this model. In addition, I'd like to collect more data by ecologists to understand plant and animal behaviors in the Great Basin. Incorporating more basins into this study would also help me see the larger picture of kind of what's going on and where people may have favored to settle. Overall, my findings contribute to the archaeological record by furthering our understanding of Paleo-Indian lifeways in the Great Basin by showing insight into which habitats the first people may have favored. My application of the ideal free distribution model offers a new way to kind of calculate habitat suitability based on different subsistence preferences. And this study shows that human settlement choices were possibly based on different subsistent, were possibly based on divergent foraging goals between members of the groups during the Younger Dryas and early Holocene in the Northwestern Great Basin. I just like to acknowledge that my work was conducted on the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Northern Paiute and Klamath peoples. And big thank you to Jeff Smith, Christopher Jaswa, and Peter Weisberg, who are all on my committee, and all my friends at the Great Basin Paleo-Indian Research Unit at the UNR, and then of course the Museum of Natural and Cultural History, Pam and Patrick there, and also funding from you guys for the Roy Jones and the UNR's GB Prue Lab. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. That's a lot of data. Do we have any questions? So I have one. How did you factor in communal antelope drives? Because we know that antelope drives were a big deal in the Great Basin. They were also a big deal out on the plains. And it seems to me that there's a seasonality thing. You can't do as many of those as you can rabbit drives, but how was that factored in there?
That's a good question. When I was looking at the different the different data for like how antelope move, I looked at antelope and and what a couple other things, but for them, that I tried to understand where they would have been during different seasons, and then tried to understand. I didn't really incorporate the drive so much because there are a couple of papers in the Northwestern Great Basin or in the Great Basin that actually talk about drives and how they would set up rock stacks to kind of trap them in there. And that's actually something I could add to the model too, because that would be a much bigger, a lot more meat in one sitting than just one at a time. So yeah, there's a lot of different things with this model that can be incorporated, that when you actually just sit down and think about it, like, oh, what would I do in this situation? And then how could that be put into the work as well, and what would that look like?
Sure. Well, and I noticed that, you had the communal rabbit drives in there. And so that might be a next step to go with this, because
Yeah.
First of all, I'd rather eat antelope than rabbit. But second of all, you can hunt rabbits pretty much every year. You can't hunt antelope like that every year. And the Great Basin is pretty clear that it was a 4 or 5, 6, 7 year, 10 years between these big antelope drives. So might be an interesting way of looking at that, because those are the two animals that you can really hunt communally in the basin. Okay, any other questions? Some questions from Zoom land.
I don't have anything, Jim.
Wow. Okay, here's a question. Okay. Okay, Megan, did you hear that question by any chance?
No, I
Okay.
didn't.
I got it here. So the question is, how did you factor in this idea that it's not just the calories, it's also the distribution of resources matching the distribution of divisions of labor, so that women and children can go do this and men can go do this, and some people can dig cattails and some people can hunt antelope. How did that factor in? Is that a factor in the settlement pattern here?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what I came to the conclusion with, or it's not really a conclusion, but more of like suggestion of what may have happened, because we do see the model showed that, yeah, the best, highest suitability areas should be those that have high return rate species. However, all of the archaeological sites that we see are usually based around basins that would have lower risk species, such as cattails. So there has to be something going on, and it seems like diversions of labor would probably be something, because you don't just have men. It'd be definitely a family group that would be in the Great Basin, and it seems like a lot of times that's left out in a lot of literature. So when you consider that the whole family is there, then you can kind of think, okay, well, maybe they're positioning themselves where both parts of this group can be collecting and contributing. It's not just men go out and hunt, or women go out and hunt. It's different parts of these groups getting different subsistence and coming together. So that's kind of what it came down to. And it's definitely not a new thing. It's definitely something that's been talked about a lot in literature, but I think it just suggested a little bit more that that's maybe what was going on. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Did I get at the question? So the question is Wapato. Did you find that in the archaeological record early on? How important is it in this? We didn't see it in the.
Oh, yeah. So that's the thing about, I wanted to include every single plant, and the Wapato is definitely very important. I know for Northern Paiute groups, and that is one that I think would definitely be going on to the next, if I continue on building the model, that would go in there as well. Because I know, especially, I believe it's during I think it's the fall is when it would have been harvested. I'm not sure. The other hard part is how many the caloric returns that it gives. And the Stephen Sims, he did a lot of research back in the 80s. And so if that isn't available, it's really hard to determine how people, we can know the significance and we can know that it's gathered, but not entirely sure how much it actually gives back to us nutritional wise. But if anyone, that would be a really fun thing to do in the future.
Aha. We've got a thesis on that, and you give an address and we'll send it to you. How's that sound?
Excellent.
Anybody else? Well, thank you, Megan. We appreciate it. It looks like you spent our money well. So good
Yes,
job.
thank you.
Congratulations on your degree.
Very, very grateful for you guys. So thank you very much.
Okay, David, I think we're ready to sign off here. Is that pretty reasonable?
Yes, I think we are.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Zeke. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Megan. It was really great.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you guys.
Okay, I'll be in touch, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Take care.